Steve, it is just great to have you today on this call with our breathed parents. You and I have been friends and colleagues in this mental health, faith, advocacy space for about 10 years. And so it's just been really great to get to know you through that time and be a part of some of the same events and same things matter, I think, to us. But give our audience, if you would, I've already given your formal bio, but if you just tell the audience a little bit about yourself, maybe where you grew up, a little bit about your family, and then I know you'll tell more of your story and kind of what led you to advocacy, and then we'll go back and I'll just let you dive into telling more about yourself.
Okay. Well, I'm the second of six children. My parents were both pastors. My uncle was a pastor. My grandfather was a pastor. My grandmother was a pastor. Um, some of you have heard me say that I come from a family with three different biological disorders of the brain. The first two are easy. One is mental illness. The other one is substance use. And the third is calls to the ministry. Somehow I didn't quite make it. But since my father was in the Army as well, we moved all over, Illinois, Maryland, Virginia, Germany, Okinawa, California, North and South. And it was just kind of a fact of life that every 2 or 3 years we were going to be moving. In fact, I remember one time when we moved and we discovered that my second to the youngest brother had his suitcase underneath his bed, packed,
Oh,
because he was afraid one day dad was going to come home and say, pack up, we're leaving. And he
wow.
wouldn't have an opportunity to get everything packed that he wanted to have. I
Wow.
went to a small liberal arts Christian college in Missouri, and then came to California to go to seminary, and somehow never made it to seminary, but got into education instead. So that's kind of
Wow.
quick overview.
Well, and as in these 10 years that I've known you, I don't recall hearing your family line of pastors and all these relatives in your family. No wonder I like you. I was a preacher's kid and I love preacher's kids, and no wonder I like you. It makes perfect sense to me now.
Well, I think I spent a lot of my teenage years trying to uh, make sure that everybody understood that the preacher's kids weren't always the kids doing the right things.
You were helping everybody understand that.
Much to my father's chagrin, yes.
I had a brother like that too. I get this. I get this. I was the good kid, and he was the one that was out there experimenting on everything and doing that
Amen.
same thing. Yeah, yeah. You'd like my brother,
Yeah,
who has since is clean and sober and is doing well. All those things.
yeah.
But so tell me just briefly, what drew you to advocacy and mental health? I know that's a part of your larger story, what you're going to tell, but just kind of briefly, and what you're doing now around advocacy.
Well, sure. My older brother um, started to behave oddly, for lack of a better word, when he was 17, 18, and ultimately was diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder. And mental illness is not something we had ever talked about in our family. So it was shattering to my parents. It was shattering certainly to me. Um, and and I think it's safe to say that he never lived the life that we had all hoped and prayed that he would live and expected him to live. And I remember when I was in college and they were in Okinawa, my brother was in Okinawa, and I would get these letters from my mother, and I wish I had saved them, but they would just bring me to tears because what they were going through with John. And it was so just completely unexplainable how my older brother, who had always done everything right, was now behaving in ways that just didn't seem possible. And I can remember one time he called me on the phone, and my brother did not swear ever, anything. And he was on the phone with me, and I thought, my God, where has he been? I didn't even know you could use those words together. And it was just a torrent of
Yeah.
speech. And then somehow I ended up in Orange County, and so did he. And my parents were back in Indianapolis. And at a certain point, they were old enough that as much as they would have liked to be his advocate and supportive of him, they were old enough that it was just too much. And so somehow, and I was the only other family member in Orange County. So my parents never said, Steve, you've got to take care of your brother. Don't misunderstand. But I felt like I was the one that needed to do it. And so I was his primary caregiver. Probably, I say caregiver, I wasn't taking care of him and feeding him, those kind of things. But when decisions needed to be made about maybe where he was going to live or those kind of things, I was his representative payee, so I paid all of his bills. Actually, to be clear, my wife paid all of his bills. But
Let's give credit where credit's due.
indeed, absolutely. And it just kind of, it was a role that I grew into. I suppose I could have walked away from it, but that never occurred to me.
Hmm.
And it's because of my brother and the struggle that he had that I got into advocacy, because anyone who's been in the system knows that it's tragically flawed.
Yes.
There are some things that it does a moderately good job of doing. And there are other things, like people with serious mental illness, like my brother had, that it's really not very effective. And part of it certainly is because of the illness itself. You know, these are not things where, hey, take one of these in the morning and take one at night and you'll be fine. It's not ever that easy. And so again, it's a role that I fell into, and I'm glad that I did. And my brother is now deceased, and I miss him.
Yeah.
I miss him. Mental
Yeah.
illness and all, I miss him.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, we've titled this conversation, things I wish I had known. And we've talked, you and I've talked before about mental health crises and, what family members can do or can't do, or what you wish you had known, all these years that you've been in advocacy and caregiving for your brother and other family members. And so just talk to us a little bit about that, what we can do in a crisis, things that you wish you had known when your family members entered into crisis and you were part of it. And yeah, just take some time and share with us your experiences.
Great. Thank you. And I do share my experiences because I think it's good for other people to know that they are not alone with this. And normally what happens, since generally we don't talk about it, is when somebody starts to have serious problems, that their initial response is, my God, nobody could possibly understand what I'm going through, because this is just unbelievable. And when we begin to share and we find out that we're not alone on this journey, and that being with someone else who's been down this road before is truly helpful. And generally we don't get that kind of support from the clinical world. We get it from others, again, who have been on the journey with us. The first thing that I'd like to make clear is that I'm not a clinician. I don't have any formal training. Everything I've learned, I learned through the School of Hard Knocks and continue to learn. And I suppose that's the option for all of us, that is, that we continue to learn. And so instead of talking to you from a clinical point of view, I'm going to talk to you from the optics of my granddaughter and my brother, both who had serious mental illness. My brother's was diagnosed as schizoaffective disorder. My granddaughter was bipolar and suicidal ideations and PTSD, and in both cases, very, very, very serious. And in my family, growing up, I don't remember ever having a conversation about mental illness or mental health or anything like that. I remember my mother talking about certain uncles or aunts that were eccentric, but that's as close as she would get to saying that they were mentally ill. And I don't know if she didn't have the language to express it, but we never talked about so and so being psychotic or delusional or anything ever
Right.
close to that.
Right.
And I can remember my mother once lamenting the fact that, where on earth did this come from? And as I'm sure you know, there is a genetic component, but you can have the genetic component and never have mental illness. And
Right,
on the
right.
other hand, you don't have any component at all and you do have it. So it's a little bit more complicated than just other members of the family. Um, but and I think that's part of what makes it so difficult to address once you realize that it's happened to your family, of all families, not your family. You could understand if the people down the street got it, but my God, what else could we have done? And and it gets difficult. And my first interaction with my brother when he was psychotic and delusional and all those things was when I was a senior in high school and we shared a bedroom together. And frankly, I didn't care what he thought or said or did. As long as he stayed out of my way, I was perfectly happy. I was a senior in high school. There were more important things than my brother's mental illness. And at that point, I'm not even sure if we were describing it as that. But I want to go back to this idea of beginning to normalize behavior. And I've already said that we characterize certain relatives as eccentric. And my guess is if we examined that again, we'd say, no, that's more like bipolar disorder, or that looks like schizophrenia. But in those days, uh, eccentric was acceptable. And then the other thing that I'd like to comment on is that when you have children, when husbands or wives have children, I guarantee you, every one of you can tell me how long they were at birth and how much they weighed. Everyone. And most of you can tell me what percentile they were in, because we start immediately comparing our children with other children. And then there's a period of time between birth and maybe 4 years of age when they first enter the school system that they're not really interacting too much outside the family. It's just us and it's them. And we immediately begin to normalize their behavior because we expect them to be at the very least normal. And so if Melissa or if John was interested in certain things, well, that's just the way John is. That's just the way Melissa is. Melissa was in the first grade in Reno, Nevada, and didn't have any friends. And we thought, well, it's obvious, she's so bright, she's not going to get along with first graders. So when they moved to Orange County, we said the solution is simple: skip her through the second grade. Third graders are much more sophisticated and intellectually capable. That's where Melissa should be. So we moved her into the third grade, and she had exactly the same problems. Mm-hmm. And I can remember, and I've told this before, but I can remember dropping Melissa and her sister off for school, and my wife would have them both dressed exactly the same. And Brittany, the second daughter, would kind of trip over the curb running to greet her new best friend. And Melissa would get out of the car and stand between the door of the car and the car itself, straightening herself, so that all the hymns were right, everything was just perfect. And at the end of the day, Brittany would come back and she looked like hell, because she'd been playing soccer all day. Their stockings were run, the hymns were gone in her clothes. I mean, she just looked terrible. And Melissa would come back to the car looking exactly like she did when she got out of the car. And I can remember her saying to me, and again, normalizing behavior, she said, "Papa," she said, "I just don't understand." She said, Brittany has more friends than I do, and she doesn't even care. Which I suspect was part of the problem. But we normalized that as just Melissa.
Yeah.
And then she went to another school, and at recess time, she'd go to the principal's office. And the principal's secretary had peppermint patties on her desk. And so Melissa would always open the bowl and have a peppermint patty at recess time. We thought, my wife and I thought, it's wonderful that she has that kind of support from school staff itself. And the secretary began to call her Peppermint Patty. But the reason she went to the principal's office is because she didn't want to interact with the kids on the playground. And we didn't put any of that together. In my brother's case, I can remember having conversations with my brother and also my parents saying that I should never allow they didn't use the word allow, that's a little strong, but I should always walk to and from school with John, because inevitably, if he were alone, somebody would start picking on him and he'd get in a fight, and he always seemed to get the short end of the stick. So if I was with him, either I would engage in the fight or they would leave John alone. And we never put any of that together. And of course, in those days, talking about bullying was not something that was particularly a hot topic. So it was a little bit different. But the point is, we normalize those behaviors. John has a difficult time making friends. Melissa has a difficult time making friends. School teachers, on the other hand, this person who's not clinically trained, at least not certainly in psychology or sociology or anything like that, start to give you feedback about, I'm sitting at one time or another in front of 100 kids your son or daughter's age, and there's something going on here. Now, they're in no position to diagnose a mental illness, so I don't even want to imply that. But they are in a position to say, back to those percentiles and height and weight and all that, they are here to say, or able to say, there's something going on here. You probably should look into it. And that's a perfect question for you to bring up with your family practice doctor or your pediatrician. Now, and they may look back at you and say they think you have a problem because your daughter or your son is perfectly normal. There's nothing here to worry about. But again, it's worth bringing up and asking, because one of the points that I really want to make is that mental illness, like cancer, is a progressive disease. Mm. If you have someone that that's diagnosed with cancer, the first question almost always is, well, what stage is it? And if it's 1 or 2, you think, praise the Lord, there's a lot that can be done. There's all sorts of things that can be done. But if it's stage 4, the conversation is, how can we make this person comfortable in the last days of their life? Mental illness is the same. Now, we don't talk about mental illness in terms of stage 1, 2, 3, or 4, so I don't even want to apply that. But it is progressive, meaning the sooner it's treated, the better the outcomes are going to be. And of course, that's what we all want. So rather than ignoring it, open the door, find out if there's anything there. And if there is, there's a lot of treatments that are available. And in 2023, we're not talking about frontal lobotomies that leave somebody permanently scarred. We're talking about talk therapy. Sometimes we're talking about medication, but there's an awful lot in the mental health world that has nothing to do with medication. So open the door and find out what kind of options you have, because again, sooner is always better. Some of the signs that we should have looked for in my family is sleep. Anyone that has difficulty sleeping, too much or too little, or not continuous enough, that is a warning sign that something is going on. And again, bring it up with your doctor. Eruptive or explosive displays of anger from a young child. Something is going on. Don't ignore it. Social skills that I've already mentioned, or isolating. In other words, I don't want to have friends. I just want to stay in my bedroom and do Game Boy or whatever they do these days. Those are not productive. Those are not positive signs. You need to get on top of it. And if all else fails, go to Dr. Google. Not everything on Google is accurate, but it's a nice place to start looking. It's access to materials that when my brother was first starting to have problems, of course, Google didn't exist. And so the only thing you could do is go to a professional. The other point that I want to make, and every time I say this, people are looking around, but out of 5 people will have a diagnosable mental illness this year. So when I am speaking to a group of 300 or 400 people, and I say that, everyone is always looking to either side, because one of them is going to have a diagnosable mental illness. Yeah. And with COVID, I don't think we've seen the last of that. They said COVID first hit, that it was the earthquake that precedes the tsunami. And exactly. I don't think the tsunami is upon us yet. And I was both happy and disappointed when recently, I think the American Medical Association decided that women and men 19 years and older should be given some sort of anxiety screening during their annual physical. I think that's a great idea. But why are we waiting until 19? Let's do it in junior high or in elementary school. And, it's all of a couple of minutes to make the initial assessment. Why not ask, find out? And anxiety is one of the outcomes of COVID, as well as depression and those kind of things. So the other thing that I want to say to you is that uh, you and I'm speaking to moms, because sadly dads normally check out of this conversation. When we teach classes, and I know I've said this before, the first thing I always do is count how many men are in the room. And then I ask myself, well, what's the percentage of men as opposed to women? Typically, if the room has more than 25% men, it's unusual, because men have a tendency to create a checklist to solve the problem. And if it doesn't work, they try another checklist. And if that doesn't work, oftentimes they check out. Mom, you take care of John. I'll bring home the paycheck. Or I'll work with you with the other kids, but John is your deal. And these women come into this class, and we started one last Friday night, so I'm reminded. The women come into the class and their
Just
faith.
tell us what class you're
I'm
talking about.
sorry. Sure. Family to family. It's one of the many classes that NAMI teaches. And the women come into the class and their faces are just drawn. They look haggard, beat up. And as the class progresses, and as you may recall, it lasts about 9 weeks. As the weeks unfold, they look, frankly, better and better and better, because they're beginning to take care of themselves. And that's the second challenge. The journey of mental illness is one where you don't really have a clear destination. You don't know what to pack to take along with you. You're moving out into the great unknown. And what I do know is that you will do better if you moms, if you take care of yourself, than if you sacrifice yourself to try to take care of the family member living with the mental illness. And that, I understand, is so difficult to do. But again, we're not talking about he's got measles, he's going to be fine in 2 or 3 weeks. Typically, we're talking about a lifetime. So it's something that you have to prepare for. And if so, the analogy that I often use is, as I've already told you, my father was a minister. And my father, I can remember as a young boy, him saying, you don't ever go to bed at night without a full tank of gas in your car. The point being that somebody could call at 2 o'clock in the morning and he'd be off to no one knows where. And if he needed gas, it was a problem. And our emotional reserves to deal with a family member with mental illness are exactly the same. And if your tank is not full, moms, you're not ready. And so you have to make it as important to take care of yourself as you make it important to take care of the other members of your family. And oftentimes that's missing. And not unlike somebody living with a mental illness, sleep is absolutely critical. If you're getting 4 hours a night, you're cheating yourself. There's no one. They used to say that some people can get by on 4 hours of sleep. They don't say that too much anymore. 7 to 8, and during stressful times, maybe even 9. But you got to get sleep, and it's got to be regular sleep. You've got to get exercise. It can be walking, it can be swimming, it can be the gym, it can be a lot of different things. But you need to be doing something to keep yourself active. Nutrition is important. I don't pretend to be a nutrition, so I'm not going to tell you anything about that. But you need to be eating well-balanced meals and eating. Mindfulness, your faith is important. Oftentimes people find the support they need through faith groups. But you must get into a support group. And I don't mean when I say that if, and I'm sure many of you know, Saddleback Church has support groups, NAMI Orange County has support groups. It's more than just attending the support group that you need, because anybody can walk through the door and sit there. You need to connect with people in the support group, because they will understand the journey that you're on better than anyone else. One of one of my favorite stories to kind of give an example to that is that I do a lot of hiking in the hills around Laguna Beach. And so this resonated with me. So they took a group of hikers and they put them on a trail, and in front of them on the trail there was a mountain. I say a mountain. There was an elevation gain, I don't know, 1,000 feet, 1,500 feet, something like that. And they asked each of them, so how much elevation gain are we looking at? Now, these were all experienced hikers, and so they had some sense of it, and they wrote down a number. Then they took exactly the same people, and now they put them with someone else. So now there's two people instead of just one. And ask them exactly the same question, come to some agreement on how tall the mountain is and give us a number. And every single time there were two, the mountain was not as tall as when there was one. Every single time. And this journey that some of you are already on is exactly the same. It's a journey more easily taken if you're accompanied by somebody else who's been on it before. So you need to find that kind of person in your life that you can talk to, that you can share experiences, that you can hear experiences, because you're going to find out very quickly that because of your experiences, like Kay, like me, you have things to share, and you will feel better for sharing them. So I would, the other thing that I wanted to say is that one of the problems with, or one of the outcomes of COVID is that remember I told you, you need to connect, not just attend. One of the problems with COVID is you get onto the screen and you see somebody and you say, hi, how are you doing? And they give you the perfunctory, I'm fine, how are you? And that's not what I'm talking about. When you're live, face to face, you say, hi, how are you doing? They say, fine, how are you? You reach out and touch them. No, really. How are you? Oh, and you're going to get quite a different response. And somehow that doesn't work as well with COVID. And the last thing that I'd like to share is some of you may have heard of a gentleman named Kevin Hines. He tells, from my standpoint, a remarkable story. He lives in San Francisco, and suicidal ideations on a fairly regular basis. And this has been going on for a long time. And one day he decides, tomorrow's the day. I'm going to walk out onto the center of the Golden Gate Bridge and I'm going to jump. And so the next day he gets up and he walks across the Golden Gate Bridge and he gets midway. And he said, unless somebody stops me, I'm going to jump. So he's got his hand on the rail and suddenly he hears a voice, Mister, this is only in 2023, right? Mister, can you take my picture? And so he takes a hold of her telephone to take her picture. She says, thank you, and walks away. He turns back to the rail and he jumps. And I've heard him tell this story more than once. He said, the minute my hands left the rail, I knew I didn't want to do myself in. I didn't want to commit suicide. So he hits the water and he's fractured a number of bones. And the next thing he knows, there's a white shark circling him. And he's thinking, my God, I'm such a miserable failure. I can't even kill myself jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge. And now I'm going to be eaten by a white shark. And he's told this story many, 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 many times. And after one of his presentations, somebody comes up to him and he says, I was there when you jumped. And it wasn't a white shark. It was a walrus holding you out of the water until the Coast Guard got there. And so he's told a story. He probably tells it better than I do, but he's told the story many, many times. And after telling the story, they have kind of a Q&A. And somebody says to him, gee, you sound like such an intelligent, which has nothing to do, incidentally, with mental illness, but you seem like such an intelligent guy, and you're so articulate. Why couldn't you just reach out? And he said, I needed somebody to reach in. And I think that's true for all of us. The perfunctory, I'm fine, how are you? when we care about people, it's not acceptable. That's not enough. No, really, tell me, how are you? And if it wasn't clear before, why I've gotten into advocacy. It's, God gives us all gifts, and what we decide to do with those gifts is really a choice that we make. And I would never, ever have hoped for my brother or my granddaughter to live with a mental illness. But the question is, so now that you've got it, what do you do with it? And to the extent that I can help other people on this journey and help them understand that the elevation in front of us is not quite as high as what they first thought, that's extremely rewarding to me. So
Mm. Thank you, Steve. That's very moving. I- I've heard you talk many times, and I'm always touched by the sincerity, the authenticity. You are doing what you do for a very important reason. Like me, there are dear family members that I know you do a lot of your advocacy and work in their memory. And none of us ever want others to suffer or go through, what we have, or our loved ones to go through what they have gone through. So I appreciate so much all the hours and years of your life that you have been active through NAMI and made such a difference in so many people's world. As I was writing down, what you were saying about normalizing, and sometimes I think we use that word can be used both as a. Could I have you scoot a little closer to your screen?
sure.
There we go. Yeah, you were fading into the background there, and I want people to see your lovely visage.
Yes,
Um, um, we use that term sometimes in a positive way, like when we talk about the stigma around mental illness. I have used that myself sometimes by saying, when you talk to somebody who has, and you put a name and a face, and you normalize it, that every single person around us, including yourself, could be living with a mental illness. People with mental illness don't necessarily look like this or look like that. And so when we're just saying, this is a normal person, this is the person you're in Bible study with, this is the guy that you stood in the line at the grocery store, and normalizing human beings. And on that side, I think it's really positive.
I
But
do
you
too.
bring up but you're bringing up a different aspect of it, which I think is a great word, which is that as family members, or sometimes even with our friends, maybe just to excuse somebody's just a little bit different, or that's just, hey, we're all individuals, that's the way you do it, this is the way I do it, and we don't necessarily think that there could be a problem. Matthew, I've said this many times, he was diagnosed when he was 7 with clinical depression, but he had been showing signs of mental illness from the time he was 2 years old. But I had no idea that children could experience mental illness. So every single symptom or behavior or action that caused us concern, it never occurred to us that it could be mental illness. And so that's what I think I'm hearing you say when you talk about normalize, is just be aware that someone's quote eccentricities or differences, or behavior that feels outside of maybe what your other kids did, or what your other grandchildren do, or your nieces or nephews or whatever. It's like, take a step back, pause, and say, I wonder if what I'm seeing is maybe related to mental illness, rather than normalizing. It's such a catch 22, because we don't want to stigmatize people. We don't
No,
want to over diagnose. We don't want to, we talk a lot about neurodiversity today. Is such a great word. And so you want to allow for people to be different without it being considered a mental illness. But what a great word to, as you say, just stop and pause and ask those questions, open that door.
well, and you make a good point. It may be nothing at all. So talk to somebody who knows more about it than you do and ask. And they may
Yeah.
look at you and say, you're overreacting. This is kind of pretty routine stuff for a 10-year-old. Good, good.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, they may say, let me talk to him or her for a few minutes and see what I think. Um,
Yeah, I think that I'd rather, as a parent or somebody who cares about, my grandchildren or nieces and nephews, I think I'd rather have somebody tell me, no, this is all okay, than to let a problem, as you say, develop and get worse before we decide to, oh, we better check this out. We better
yeah,
we better
and
get some
then
help on this.
looking back, saying, "Lord, I began to see signs 7 years ago,
Yeah.
and I didn't respond perhaps the way I should have."
Your example of comparing it to cancer and the like you said, there aren't stages in mental illness in that precise way that there are in illnesses like cancer, but that's still a very helpful analogy to think of, because all of us know somebody who's had cancer, or maybe perhaps had it ourselves, and that staging is so helpful in people knowing what treatments are available, what you can expect as an outcome, how hard the fight might be, related to that cancer journey. And to think of mental illness in a similar fashion is a powerful way of saying, well, gosh, no, none of us want our children, our loved ones, to be diagnosed at stage 4 when they are so ill that it's going to be very difficult for them to kind of fight their way back through to any sense of a normal life. um, but just to keep that in mind, as better outcomes more typically come with earlier diagnosis and more help. That's a great picture to use.
Yeah, the other thing that I wanted to mention is that there's no one listening that doesn't know people living with a mental illness, and we don't have a clue who they are because they're managing it so well and
Yes.
seem so productive, or they're so smart, or whatever it is. And the idea of mental illness never even crosses our mind. So I don't want to leave people with the perception of, oh Lord, if you have a mental illness, it's downhill all the way. It's just not. It's just not. There are brilliant people out there living very productive, happy lives that have a diagnosis. And again, we don't have a clue who they are, unless, of course, they share it.
Sure. That is a great reminder. Your comments about men, oh, there's so much I could say, but not in a pejorative way, not in a mean way, or not put down the men or the dads. And for the men and the dads that are on this call right now, I'm so grateful for your presence. I'm so glad that you're here. It's really, from our own experience with a child with a serious mental illness, we did have to wrestle through that, just our personality differences. Rick so wanted to be able to help. He so wanted to do something. He wanted to do something that would make a difference for Matthew. And so all the things that he tried, and he tried so hard to let some of his actions make a difference, and was frustrated. I've said many times, because Rick has said this about himself, so I'm not saying something he hasn't said. It broke his heart to be an author who wrote a book, The Purpose Driven Life, which answers tries to answer some of the questions of why on earth am I here? What am I here for? And his own beloved son struggled till the day he died with the why on earth am I here for? What is my purpose? Why did God put me here? And Rick wanting so badly to be able to answer that for his son, and not able to, the grief that caused, the frustration, the helplessness. And I think maybe sometimes, maybe some of the dads find themselves in that place of, I tried, I've done everything I know to do. I've given it my best interest, my best creativity. I've tried this, I've tried that, and if their son or daughter is not responding, in a way that they're still really having a hard time, I know it can lead to that place of just like, okay, I don't know what else to do. So I guess you're going to have to handle it. So would you mind just talking a little bit more about that maybe to dads?
Yeah, thank you. Because yeah, I don't want to leave anybody with the impression that I don't think dad should be involved, and I don't want to leave anybody with the impression that their family members will do better if dads and moms stay involved and kind of attack this problem, if you will, together, as opposed to one or the other. Um, but I think dads bring an important point of view to the table. And I think it's important that, again, moms and dads work on it together, because I think the outcomes will be better. And as soon as dad checks out, if that's what happens, uh, then it just obviously puts an enormous burden on mom. And, you have this child together, and you should help them live the life that you wanted for them together.
Mm. I think also one of the I can say this for sure in our family, even though Rick often felt frustrated that he didn't know how to help Matthew. He didn't have an answer, a solution that made his mental illness go away or even be more manageable. What I can tell you is that Matthew knew his dad loved him, by the ways that Rick was engaged and involved. And if probably the most powerful thing that any dad could give to his son or his daughter is not that they have an answer, but that they show up, that they are there to love and to care, and to grieve together, to weep together as father and child over things sometimes that don't seem to be able to be fixed, but to not feel like I just don't think we understand how deeply important it is to just simply love each other with our words, with our bodies and hugs, with our presence. Um, it may not fix anything, but I can tell you for sure that when Matthew died, he knew his mom and his dad loved him. And that is something I'll always be grateful that Rick hung in there, even when he didn't know what to do, when he felt very frustrated, when he felt so helpless. He never walked away. And there's no way that that could ever be. Um, I couldn't, I love him so much for the ways that he just loved Matthew. So, moms and dads, this is a really tender point because we all, moms and dads, come to those places sometimes of just feeling like, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to make this better. And there is a temptation sometimes to just kind of like walk away, even if not physically, emotionally. And I appreciate your encouragement to just stay in there, you know, stay in there, because not only do we need support groups, but our loved ones need the kind of love that says, I won't leave you. I won't leave you. You're not going to walk through this by yourself.
Yeah.
Steve, I just can't thank you enough for your time. I told you that I was going to end by asking you, is there anything that's giving you hope in this sometimes very broken, world of mental health and mental health quote system and lack of system and stuff. So I'll give you that chance to answer. What is there anything giving you hope, or what gives you hope?
And I think I don't even know what I said when you first asked me the question, but I always have hope.
Yeah.
My hope is endless, and some might characterize it as naive, but the people that I interact with in the system, I don't ever walk away from those people saying, well, they don't even care. What are they doing in this field? The people that I know in the system, and I know a large number, all want the very best for my brother and my granddaughter and for Matthew. I never walk away saying they're in the wrong field. They went into the field because they cared. And I think sometimes we're careless in how we respond to them, which I think is a mistake. They're there trying to help us. Um, and and again, hope springs eternal, certainly for me. And I think someday that these problems will be addressed. I don't know if I'll be alive when we come to the answers, but again, the people that I've come to know surrounding this conversation about mental illness are remarkable people. Remarkable.
Absolutely.
I wouldn't
Yeah.
trade it for anything. And again, anything that I can do to help move it in the right direction, I'm certainly interested in doing. So I
So we're
am.
just going to call you, we're going to call you Steve Eternally Hopeful Pittman. Thank you so much for being with us. Really, really appreciate it. It's always good to talk to you.
Nice talking with you.
Thanks.